Welcome everybody to the Military Libraries Virtual Summit, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Christina Mrozek. I'm from the Army MWR Libraries Office in San Antonio, and I'm the host for this session, which is called the Writing History in the Modern Era with our author, Jim DeFelice. Our moderator today is Michael Steinmacher. Thank you all who will introduce the speaker. Thank you all for joining us. I'll turn it all over to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, as Christina said, I'm Michael Steinmacher. I am the Director of Library Services for Ivy Tech Sellersburg in Indiana. I am the former Supervisory Librarian at Fort Knox, Kentucky, up until about a month ago. And I'm honored to host our session this afternoon with New York Times bestselling author Jim DeFelice. Jim is known for his vivid and raw, powerful portraits of American heroes, such as Navy SEAL Chris Kyle, with which he worked on the #1 New York Times bestselling book, American Sniper, and his groundbreaking biography of America's last five-star general, Omar Bradley. Jim delves deeply into the human experience with of war, history, politics, and cutting-edge technology. He's written on a wide range of subject matter, and his nonfiction work includes They Called Us Lucky, The Life and Afterlife of Iraq's War Heroes' Hardest Hit Units, and Westlight Lightning, The Brief Legendary Ride of the Pony Express. His nonfiction includes the Dreamland series with Dale Brown and the Rogue Warrior series with SEAL Team Daddy Richard Marchenko. Jim also helped create and wrote storylines for several video games, most notably Ace Combat, Assault Horizon, and Afro Samurai. And I will say that in my experience, in my time working as an Army librarian, Jim has been nothing but positive, supportive, and a guest at Barr Memorial Library, and I thank him for that. And today, rather than listening to me just drone on with lots and lots of questions, I have a few questions for Jim, and then we're going to take the balance of the time taking your questions. But first of all, Jim, welcome, and what would you like to say at the beginning of this, talking about recording history in the modern age?
First of all, thank you for having me, and I have to say that really anything I can do for libraries, the debt that I owe to libraries, even before I started writing, is just so incredible that I'm never gonna be able to get it in balance. And certainly, I'd say on all of the nonfiction and the many of the fiction books that I've done, libraries have been absolutely essential. You mentioned the biography of Omar Bradley, and being able to, just to access the Bradley, or many of the Bradley papers through libraries, have just been, I could not have done the books. Those books especially, or even Rangers at Dieppe, which is about the Rangers in World War II, their birth, no way that either of those books could have been done without libraries. So thank you guys all for having me. We'll see how I do with Michael. Sometimes I feel like, it's okay. These are your oral exams. Hopefully I don't fail too badly.
Oh, you're not going to fail too badly, because this is subject material, and subject material well. I've been thinking about talking with you about this, and talking about recording historical data and facts, so on and so forth. But, the current state of America, I'm trying not to make this political, but how do you define facts, and what underpins factual information, Jim?
Oh, sure. Let's start out with an easy question. And remembering, one of the Rangers at Dieppe, which is a book first and foremost about the Ranger action in World War II when they started, but also one of the sub-themes of that book is the difficulty really in kind of pinning down, precise facts. Whether it's something like, okay, where exactly did the first American fall on the battlefield in Europe? based on different accounts, or even just looking at the after action reports of that battle. I think that I forget, there's about a dozen after action reports from guys who were there, and about 20 different versions of what actually happened. So, it can be difficult to ascertain. I think that the important role for a writer, for a historian, I should say, although I don't call myself a historian, I will call myself a writer, but is to kind of sift through all of the available information, to weigh it, and then to present it. There are, when you're dealing with something that happened in the past, it's a plus and a minus thing. There's a lot of information potentially available to you. On the other hand, don't you may have so much information that it's difficult to decide first of all, what's valid, what makes sense, and then how to use it. One of the things that I have been thinking about lately, especially I've done several books on World War II. I'm in a lot of cases, the facts themselves aren't necessarily in question or being debated. What's being debated, or what's often debated, are the interpretation. How do you interpret that fact? Was this, for instance, what was this battle successful, or what might have been done, what might not have been done? And I think that in a lot of cases, certainly if I'm picking up a book about World War I, World War II, or anything in the past, I'm actually interested in the interpretation of those facts, where to put those facts, where they fit, what the implications of those facts are, and that's really why I'm reading. So I want the historian or the biographer who's writing. I want to hear what someone who has spent enormous amounts of time, generally gone through enormous amounts of material, and see what he or she thinks or is making. So if you already have a lot of background in the material, then that's very useful. I try to start, let's say I wanted to learn something about the 30 Years' War, of which I know nothing, except probably it was, I'm going to guess it wasn't really even 30 years. It was probably, 31 or something. Some editor somewhere trying to sell a book decided to round it to 30 because the 32.5 year war wouldn't quite sell as well. But I want to, in any event, when I'm picking up information on that, I start with something that's fairly generic, and then try to move to the interpretations. I think it's always, as a writer, whether you're doing a biography or history, the onus is on you to try to sort through all of those facts and get as close to the truth and the reality that you can.
I do want to remind folks that if you have questions for Jim, please put them in the chat. We'll work them into the conversation. But along that line, Jim, perceptions and opinions change over time. And I think about something about like the wars in the Gulf, just how much they've changed since the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War. And I wonder how they're going to be perceived in the future. Do you feel like there's any sort of pressure on you to capture and contextualize the time in which you're writing about, especially when you're dealing with someone who is a living, breathing subject, and we don't have the benefit of hindsight like we do with somebody like Omar Bradley?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I think, for instance, you mentioned American Sniper, and I think that both Chris and I were very conscious of trying to present as much as possible an unvarnished view of what it was like for a SEAL sniper, and his family during that. Actually, he had 4 deployments, but during that portion of the war, and that was kind of that's where we started. That was our agreement to begin. that's what we were interested in. Now, not every memoir or even biography is like that, but the things that I'm interested in are the things that show what reality is like, warts and all. And you have to be prepared for a certain amount of, for a certain amount of criticism. Criticism for mistakes, frankly, is totally warranted. You try to fix your mistakes. Criticism for, for something that's factual and you've got it right anyway. Unfortunately, these days that comes with the territory. You have to kind of expect it.
So when I look at your work, I see that a broad variety of biographical scope. I see somebody like Chris and Taya Kyle, for that matter, who
Sure.
you were able to work with directly one-on-one in real time. But then I see somebody like Omar Bradley, who you didn't have access to, obviously, but he's a known, well-known historical figure. So when you approach your work, like whether it be the Kyles or General Bradley, how do you work in the past versus work in the present? Is there any difference in the way you approach your work?
Okay, well, so with Bradley, I have to say that just kind of as full disclosure, that the reason I did Bradley is I won't say that I got angry, but Bradley had nobody had really done much work on Bradley, and a lot of the work that's on, or alleged work on Bradley where he appears in other places, is just not correct or not full. So maybe I wasn't totally unbiased when I set out. The big difference between working on, especially a historical figure like Omar Bradley, I mean, there's all sorts of records. He wrote, first of all, he wrote a phenomenal first-person memoir that's very good. It's based largely on notes that one of his aides took during the war, and if you compare the notes to the book, it's very close. He's not really not covering up anything, including the fact that Bradley tried to cover up Patton's slapping incidents. But in that case, I was also fortunate. In that case, there were a few people who had worked with Bradley aides and that sort of thing. So they were, very admittedly a limited resource by the time I was working. The same with the Ranger book that I mentioned earlier. With Chris, obviously, and in that case, that's a memoir, and that's going to be presented in really from his point of view. And the primary source for that, although I did do obviously a lot of research to be able to put be able to have his experiences within the larger war and understand some of the battles that he fought in. He was the primary source, and we spent weeks and weeks together doing formal and informal interviews. We may have done a little drinking. Taya and Taya also helped tremendously with that book. They actually, Taya and Chris stayed with us for a while, and I stayed with them working. Obviously, that's kind of the first. That's a massive amount of material, and then from there again, talk to other people who had been there. And then also there are records, for instance, understanding, I think I mentioned the Battle of Fallujah, after action reports there were a lot more focused, I should say, than the ones from the Rangers. But in order to understand what the Marines did, it was the second Battle of Fallujah I'm talking about. Those after action reports were very helpful. And obviously there's all sorts of other material, just not as much as with somebody like Bradley.
Kimberly asks, with a modern biography on a living person, there can be maybe too much media using body cams, photo cameras, phone cameras, and social media. How can this be best interpreted for history?
I think that's a question that there is no easy answer for that. I mean, the amount of material that we have potentially available to us now compared to even 10 years ago. I mean, if you look at the difference between, say, the beginning of, well, it would go back to the Gulf War or Second Gulf War, I guess, the beginning of that, and compare it with, you know, more recent or towards the end of the occupation. There's just a huge difference when we're even working on, they called us lucky, which, you know, the action in that book had taken place about, I guess, roughly 10 years, we called it a decade before I started writing about it. I mean, I've just had, you know, just oodles and oodles of photographs and, you know, and video from the guys, not even from, there were definitely things from the network, from network reporters and stuff, but I had stuff, I had, you know, video from the guys that were in the battle, you know, in gunfights, and, you know, pictures taken a few moments, literally moments after somebody had been hit. I mean, that's just, on the one hand, those are tremendous resources, uh, you know, but the big problem, yes, is sorting through that, and I don't know in future how it's going to be done. You know, you're going to have to set up, I guess you're going to have to set up some sort of filters and, you know, kind of reduce it. I don't know. It's, but I would say that certainly most historians would prefer that problem than dealing with the problem of not having enough information.
Taking that question and kind of stretching it out, pushing it more back to more of a past historical sort of incident as opposed to living in the moment. When you're looking at firsthand accounts of things to use, how do you balance firsthand accounts of people who may not be famous, maybe somebody who was on the fringe that saw it, that sort of thing, and then put it in context or next to a historical figure who might be more known? Is there a way that you determine a ratio of how to balance that sort of thing out, or how do you go about reconciling accounts, I guess is what I'm really trying to get at?
Well, actually, Michael, I'm going to reveal now one of the big secrets of writing history. There's actually an algorithm that we all use, but if I told it to you, I'd have to kill you. So I'm afraid it's top secret.
Okay.
You do, you know, obviously you have to balance it, and you know, it's not a court of law or anything, but you have to consider what, you know, what acts a person has to grind. Someone who's famous, and someone, you know, I said that Bradley's memoir is really, really good, and it is. It's really, really good because it's as far as I can see, mostly more. It leaves things out rather than, you know, it doesn't lie about things. It just leaves them out. It certainly puts his spin on a couple of places. But, you know, if you kind of compare that, say, to Crusade, and I like, you know, Eisenhower was a tremendous general, tremendous president, but, you know, his memoir on World War II, the Crusade, is, you know, interesting but not particularly useful. So you have to judge, okay, what acts is this person grinding? Is this book, when they did their memoir, say, or their account, you know, when, you know, General Westmoreland is talking to the press during, you know, Vietnam. What else is going on? What is he trying to accomplish? Because, you know, he has an agenda, and that's not necessarily to, you know, leave a full historical record. So, and again, the things that really help you are the background research, and, you know, and understanding a lot of context, seeing documents, having talked to people that have different views, or looking at oral histories. Oral histories are actually very useful. In World War II, for instance, there's a lot of oral and video histories. The difficulty with a lot of those is that they are based on human memory. So if I'm remembering something that happened 20 years ago, say, or 30 years ago, even though it's very vivid and very exciting, and thus, you know, imprinted on my mind, I may have forgotten, I may have had a bad perspective, and now I've told the story so many times that the other thing is that in interviewing someone, and say, interviewing Chris or any or Taya, in some ways it's much easier or you get, I'd say it's easier, but you're bound, generally can get answers and information that's not as slanted from someone who's, they're not famous, they didn't have any extra, right? Chris didn't even want to write the book, but on the other hand, you have to be very, very careful about introducing information or kind of prompting them to give a certain slant, and that's tough. One of the ways I try to avoid it is, besides being aware of that potential, is to come back to a specific, come back to topics. For instance, with Sniper, basically everything in the book went through. I did separate interviews on everything at least twice, and then went back and talked to. But it's difficult. That's what, and that's really what. That's why historians get the big bucks. I just kind of hang out, drink coffee. So.
It's interesting, and leading into our next question from Michael, not me, another Michael. I think when we first met, you were talking about codename Johnny Walker, which is very, in my mind, similar in the vein to something like American Sniper, with being a firsthand account and so on and so forth. But it's very different in many ways. Michael's question is, how do you go about finding a new subject or subject, person, or thing, in the case of the Pony Express, to write about? And he actually has a second part to that. And if that person or event has been written about, how do you find new aspects to dig in and write your story?
Okay, so it's always a little different. I mean, there are different ways it is. So Johnny, I ended up doing Johnny. Chris and I were working on Sniper at some point. We would basically work the whole day in certain weeks. We were together, and we'd get up whenever 8 o'clock or whatever Chris got up on an early rise. And we would go from there until whenever we just kind of pooped out. And this one night we kind of pooped out, and we're just kind of hanging out. And we just threw on some pictures from one of his deployments, and we're going through the pictures. And at this point, I knew most of the members of the team by sight. And there comes on this picture of this guy with this, pardon my language, but this shit-eating grin. He's wearing weird camo. He's wearing strange fatigues. I said, Chris, who's that? Chris kind of does. I can't do Chris's Texas accent, but Chris says, well, that's the only Iraqi I really ever trusted behind me with the gun. And he told me a little tiny bit about John. And it kind of flashed forward, I don't know, probably about a year or so. The book had come out. Chris was out in California, and I was back. I think I was back east. I know I was either east or overseas, but all of a sudden I get this call from our editor, actually, at the who had done American Sniper, Peter Hubbard. Peter says, "Hey, Chris says you're supposed to write a book on this Iraqi guy, Johnny Walker, and if you don't, he's going to, I forget what he was going to choke me out or something." I said, "Oh, well, I guess I better do it." And fortunately, so I talked to Johnny, and fortunately, our editor book became codename Johnny Walker. Very, very different individual than Chris, and that's why that's such a book. But it's such a different book. Choosing the subjects, largely, that one aside, generally it's something that interests me. The Pony Express. I think I had always liked the Pony Express when I was a kid, and I was having lunch with the same editor, and we were just talking about different things. And for some reason, I started talking about the Pony Express and don't remember why. Maybe a horse went, I think it was probably in Manhattan, so this can't be true, but maybe a horse went down the street. I mean, and he said, hey, nobody's done a book on the Pony Express in a really long time. I said, really? So the thing that, attracted me about that was not so much that, well, I mean, obviously horses and who can go wrong? But the fact of when it happens and the opportunity in that book to talk about what was going on in America and kind of capture America just at this point, is right before the Civil War. You have all this other stuff going, including a lot of corruption in Congress, which was a lot of fun to write about.
So it's interesting, we mentioned the Pony Express book, both of us, in the last couple of questions. And that book to me has a great spirit about it. It captures something about that time. It carries itself. It just moves with a sense of fluidity. I guess maybe I'm getting into the horse imagery myself too, thinking about it. But do you try to imbue your books with a sense of spirit, and where does that come from, if that's the case?
Well, first of all, I think every book is different, obviously, but yeah, I think doing a memoir, for instance, what my aim is to be able to put into print the person's voice, so that if they had the tools that I have to translate things to the written page, then then this is how they would sound. And it's not, I mean, when I do a memoir, I work a lot with tape interview, or record, I should say. But I don't think I've ever used tape, but you have I use voice recorders and stuff and record, but that doesn't actually translate into prose on the page. There's little kind of clues and cues you can use. With Chris, in some ways, to get his voice was relatively easy because it's a Texas accent, and so there's some things you can do with that. Taya, by contrast, has a very because she's lived in a bunch of different places and for other reasons, she has a very flat affect. And what worked with her to get really, I struggled until I found the key to her voice really was humor. She always had some way of lightening up something, tell a lot of jokes, and could use that to kind of get into that voice. With something like a third person book, which Pony Express, for instance, is, and the Ethos, that's that's just my voice, and there it's selecting the voice that I think is most appropriate to the subject. Rangers at the F is a pretty heavy subject. It's about a battle which, although the Americans did well, everybody else on the American side did very poorly. So that's a serious subject. You need a serious tone. Pony Express, I mean, let's face it, most of the great stuff about the Pony Express that you hear, that you think is not true. They're tall tales, and why were they telling these tall tales? For various reasons, in which we go into in the book, but they're fun. Entertainment is the primary reason, and so the voice there has to be, has to pick that up. Thank you for the compliment that it seems to have worked, at least for you.
Well, again, one of the things that I think about, and I'm finding myself in my new role working with students on a daily basis, is talking about presentation of information and presenting information, making an argument, or trying to produce something that's balanced. And again, in this hyper situation that we find ourselves in America, bias is a word that comes up a lot. And I'm curious, do you find yourself these days feeling more pressured to present things as even-handedly as you can, or how does that play into your mind as you're working these days?
Yeah, the thing is, you have to define bias, I think. In terms of being even-handed, I think that's my obligation. I think that I have to be as fair, as possible and present. And I just trust my readers to understand that I'm presenting both sides and they can interpret it. But again, I come back to, the reason that somebody's reading my book as opposed to someone else's is they want my interpretation. And, I think that it's my responsibility if there's reason of doubt a certain version to say that, to give that. As far as, the whole issue of being PC or that offending someone, I think that while the intention is good, generally is good, that it has resulted in for a lot of writers and certain publishers in censoring. Censor is not really the right word, but holding back information or phrasing things in ways that they're not offensive, but they also kind of distort the truth. And I'm fortunate in that I'm in a position that, not to say that not controversial, but I'm in a position where I can, I think, make an argument that it should be a certain way. The American Sniper starts out, I hate savages. The publisher did not like that. Argued excessively argued that it should be changed, and I insisted that we keep that, as did Chris. And I think we were fortunate, to have that editor, publisher. But I think if I was starting, maybe if I was starting out, I didn't have a lot of experience and or a good track record and having done a number of times bestsellers by then. Maybe I would have lost that argument. I don't know if I would have lost that argument. I might not have been able to make it. I may have been a little bit too scared. Editors have generally really good points. The problem is, the ratio of really good points to really bad points sometimes is come see, come saw. Peter's a great editor, so very high ratio, Peter, if you're listening to this. But and then there's other things that kind of in the middle where
So Holly has a couple of questions, and I'm curious. We'll start with her second one. How do you decide who you will collaborate with, and what makes a good collaborator for you?
Okay, I decide at this point, certainly I decide based on generally on whether the stories that I really like the story, and when it's something that I think I can do something with. There's personal reasons. When talking with Chris came. I knew with that book that there have been a bunch of books that I didn't that were kind of BS books and stuff about about war and stuff. I just got the immediate sense from talking with Chris that he wasn't like that. I wanted to talk about the families, because nobody had until that point, until Sniper, nobody had really paid much attention to what the families had gone through in the war, and he was all for it. He was all about that, so that was great. He and I had to talk, and he mostly did talk to participating, but we got over that hurdle. And the thing with Chris, and there are personal things involved, and Chris wanted to do the book and set it up so that the two guys who had died kind of while he was their leader, say, depending on when we're talking about, but he was in charge of them, so they were his command. He wanted to benefit the families, and it's really. I'm sorry, I don't call me a soft touch or whatever. But it's really hard for me to resist that sort of thing. It's hard for me to resist that. It's hard for me to resist things where I think somebody's been done an injustice and I'm trying to set the record straight. Having said that, I mean, admittedly, I am a commercial writer. I write for large audiences, and I cannot. This is how I make a living, and I can't write about. I occasionally will kind of stray, but generally, what I'm trying to do are books that are going to sell well, and and there's a whole list of different things, and nobody really totally knows. But and Omar Bradley was not made because I thought it was going to be a bestseller. So just to get that straight.
So I'm going to combine a couple of questions that we've had in the chat because they're definitely related. So one of the questions is, how do you prioritize what you read first of your research, which leads to the larger question of, can you give us a thumbnail view of how you go about the creative process in general?
Okay, so all right. Well, first of all, every book's different. Okay, but let's talk. And fiction and nonfiction. Obviously, in nonfiction, there's far more emphasis on research than in fiction. But that's not to say that fiction doesn't have a large amount of research. But we talk about nonfiction. And, it's difficult to say exactly where I start. I will do. Um, I'll just be interested, say, in a topic or find out something, some piece of information off the wall that I thought was very interesting. Or in the case of Pony Express, I mean that whole idea in the book really kind of fit into a project that I was trying to do at the time, and talking about American history by picking out different incidents over the course of our 200 and some years. So that would. Um, I start with general research first. In the case of, say, one of the World War II books that I did, two of the recent memoirs, I come from having read a lot of World War II stuff, starting as when I was a kid, but certainly had read a lot, had done a lot. Bradley, so I actually had a decent background. But if I was doing World War I, for instance, I would start with some very basic World War I takes. It's kind of overall history. I'd want to read a couple of them so that I understood, different perspectives, and then I would start to specialize in where I was working, and have that kind of generic interest. When I ended up doing Every Man a Hero, that actually started out as a different book that was going to start out that was going to be a book on D-Day. And in the process of doing kind of generic research, and I wanted to talk to different guys who had been there, we were all by that point well into them. I came across Ray. His actual story was so much more interesting than just focusing just on D-Day that I changed what I was doing. And at that point, I besides doing the kind of research, I knew what questions to ask. He had been in every seaborne invasion in Europe with the exception of Italy, up until D-Day. So obviously, I had to refresh my memory. I had to do a lot of research, and here I was helped out by my wife occasionally. At the time, I should say, was working as one of my research assistants. I had another assistant, Ray Fishona, who actually he's the guy that helped me track down Ray. He did a whole bunch of work. I had to learn a lot about just medical procedures at the time, because he was a medic. I had never written about that. I'd never met a World War II medic. and then I want to get my research to the point where I can talk reasonably well, and ask so I know what to ask the person, and I kind of know where we're going to go with the book, although there's always surprises. Then I would do the formal research, formal interviews rather, with the subject, the person I'm working with, say on a then I would supplement that and see where my major holes were, and supplement that with. I think in that case, I probably talked to a couple other veterans, or found out, trying to remember, found out about the landing craft. Say, how much did the plank that, the front, how much did that weigh because he got hit by it? That kind of research. Then I start writing the book, leaving kind of holes and notes on areas where I'm going to have to go back. I'm going to have to ask him more questions, and I'm going to have to do more research. And then when I kind of go back through, do that research, talk to him, and then I write it. The thing with one of the differences with fiction would be that I would do a bunch of research up front. Say let's say we were writing the Dreamland books, which are all, say, Air Force. They're all Air Force at the time, near future. Although it pleases me no end that what we were envisioning at the beginning of the 2000s, is now not passe, but it's now been incorporated well into reality. But so I would do a bunch of research on that, especially on places. I like to go to the places I'm writing about, though obviously that's not always possible. And then I would write the book, and again, goals. I like, as I'm writing, go back to the creative process here. I like to actually, just once I start writing something, a first draft, I just want to just keep going until I have a first draft done. A lot of writers are not like that. I think either you've spoken to Jerome Preissler or you will be. And I know he's absolutely not like that. He will write a page and he will not go back to that. Claims he will not go back to that. I'm sure he does, but he claims he doesn't. But I want to write a first draft. I want to have something there and then go back, kind of iron it out, and fill in those holes. That's kind of a rough idea of creative.
So there is a comment that was put into the chat that is too great not to bring up, suggesting that Lin-Manuel Miranda should do a production of Bradley. Would you like to work on the book? Would you like to work on the book with him on that one?
Good, yeah. You may have to beat. Yeah, man. He's his stuff is phenomenal. Jeez. And he has. I don't know how much. I don't know how many of his works you've seen, but he has an incredible team, and yeah, it would be fantastic. Great.
So, got just a couple more questions. Do you feel the pressure to translate your research into page-turning literature, or what's your reaction to that question?
Okay, so I mean, we would have like a big discussion on literature, whether it's what high or low stuff, and I would just take us off the tangent. I think what I feel, what I have to do is, again, because I'm trying to write as a general rule, occasionally I guess there have been some exceptions, but I'm trying to write for a mass audience. I'm trying to write for a lot of people. So it's on me to make that interesting and exciting for a lot of people. And, partly you do that by choosing the stories that you're going to write about. But also, listen, there are days when, I can't say you're phoning it in, but, you just kind of get in that mode where it's just not coming, but you got to do it. That's, hopefully you catch that on the draft or your editor catch that. I think that the yeah, you do feel pressure to make it interesting and exciting. You just try to do that as many days as you possibly can.
So we're going to wrap it up. I'm going to wrap it up with one question, and I wanted to make sure that I got this quote right because it's frequently misquoted. You'll know it. George Santayana said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." How do we remember the past, Jim, without allowing modern sensibility to color that memory, or is that okay?
Well, see the thing. Okay, so first of all, so I'm going to answer that in two parts. But the other quote about history that's very famous and that I always think of, and I think that is in a way even more true, and I don't know who said it, but history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And I think that it is incumbent on us it's incumbent on us to understand history so that when it does rhyme, we can deal with it hopefully at least as well as the people in the past, hopefully better. I think though that it's knowing history is really valuable, and it can be, yes, I kind of what you're getting at is it can be viewed as a criticism of us, and that we tend to a lot of times, and I'm sure I do this too, we look back on what happened to somebody doing something 200 years ago, and we're interpreted through our lens, and we're wrong, or to stick to more of the topics that we've been talking about. I look at a battle in World War II, and I'm nice, warm, comfortable, nice office. I have all these resources at my beck and call and all these other opinions, and I can say, oh, that general didn't know what he was doing, he should have done this, and this. That's BS, obviously. But on the other hand, I think having a modern sensibility can allow us to interpret events and to understand the past a lot better. I think, for instance, that because of COVID, for instance, we have a much better understanding looking back at not only what the effects of the quote unquote Spanish flu was right after World War I and how badly that affected the US, but we can also look back at at what that must have done to different populations, intentional, but mostly certainly unintentional, over the vast amount of history, and understand what people, or to some extent what those people in the past went through. So I think it's a double-edged sword, and yes, I agree that we have to always watch ourselves and not put our values and perspectives necessarily in the past. I mean, there are certain truths, I think, throughout that remain humankind that we have to adhere to. But I think that sometimes our perspective can help us. And again, and now to get back to Santayana said, that perspective can be used to, okay, well, what can we do now, knowing what happened in the past? How can we effectively deal with whatever it is, whether it's war, COVID, or, how can libraries help us going forward?
Well, Jim, I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to talk with us today. This has been a lot of fun and very informative in so many different ways. Thank you again on behalf of the Department of the Army Library Program and the Special Libraries chapter of the Special Library, the Military Libraries chapter of the Special Libraries Association. As you can tell, my brain is fried. I'm becoming an academic, but I'm still have one foot in my own historical past. So thank you again. Thank you for your support of the military and your support of libraries. It means a great deal to us.
It's my pleasure and honor to do what I can.
Okay. Well, we've been talking with New York Times bestselling author Jim DeFelice about historical representation. And that will conclude our program